Zelensky has taken the country to war. And I'm sure within his ranks there are people who think that he has been responsible for the plight of Ukraine. There are people who, in my view, legitimately think that this war could have been avoided. There are people who legitimately think that he was forced into this war. I personally would not be surprised if there are people within Ukraine who would even say that he be prosecuted. I wouldn't be surprised. His best bet, if the war ends and he does not seek a new mandate, is possibly to find refuge somewhere in Western Europe and watch the events from afar. You know, one of the things that we must remember is that there is a context to what we are seeing now. Because in the year 2014 or thereabouts, during the administration of President Yanukovych, the elections were held on the platform that we were eliminating a regime that was beholden to Russia, that was corrupt, systemically corrupt, and that we were coming in as the new team that was going to eliminate corruption. And Zelensky then occupied office on that basis. And it is never lost on me that Zelensky was an actor and that he acted the office of the presidency at one time, and that the individual who is now at the very center of this corruption was the producer of some of the programs in which he featured. Having then come to power on the basis of fighting corruption, it surprises some, but does not surprise many, that the system which is there is perhaps more corrupt than the system that was inherited. And at that time, it was being argued that the Yanukovych administration was one that was giving practical meaning to what the West characterized as Russian-made and Russian choreographed and controlled corruption. What then happened, one may ask? Nothing happened. They inherited a system and they have perfected corruption, and it has happened particularly during this war period when there's acquisition of arms, acquisition of provisions, and people have been feathering their nests, and all institutions which are active in Western Europe have been aware of this reality. And I wouldn't be surprised if ultimately this particular chain ends up at the very top. We have started seeing individuals falling and they are resigning. Of course, they are saying they are not culpable. But when you see people close to the president now beginning to fall, it tells you that the heat is closer to some source, which sooner rather than later will be disclosed. You know, what I'm saying can be characterized as speculative, but philosophers of old once said that if you want to know a leader, you've got to ask yourself, who is he or she surrounding himself with? And to that extent, therefore, that kind of reasoning leads me to suggest that the president may very well be in the know. And if he is in the know, sooner rather than later, it is going to come out. And there is no smoking gun yet, but the arrows are pointing in that direction. And some of the individuals who are leaving office, if they succeed in getting out of Ukraine, perhaps they'll spill the bean, or the beans, as some would want to render it in the plural form. You know, the psychology of Europe is one that demands study. If you look at Europe to mean Western Europe, to mean countries which are in the forefront of the fight against Russia since the end of the World War II, before it became Russia and after the collapse of the Berlin Wall, have always wanted to paint this picture that we, like Caesar's wife, are beyond reproach. We are the countries that are supposed to tell the world what to do. We are the ones that are the home of this, or the homes of these institutions, whether it's Transparency International, all these non-governmental organizations whose claim to fame is that they look for faults everywhere and to characterize administrations which they call regimes as being corrupt. And this is the kind of narrative that they wanted to push. They wanted to push a narrative that to ensure that Russia is besmirched. They characterize every administration that is seen to be pro-Moscow as corrupt. And they did that very effectively. And riding on the crest of that propaganda, Zelensky then rose to power, as I've already indicated, rising to power on the basis that we are going to fight corruption. But we all know that corruption is alive and well in all societies. That is the reality. It's just the degree that varies from one society to the other. And in certain societies, it is the exception rather than the rule. In certain societies, it is the rule rather than the exception. So when Zelensky came out as this messiah who was going to liberate Ukraine from the chains of Russia, and the only way to do is to cut the umbilical cord and to join the European Union and ultimately to join NATO. He was then projected in the manner that normally Europe does. When Europe wants to hoist people to a certain level, they do a number of things. They propagandize. They characterize you as holy. Sometimes they give you awards, and the Nobel Peace Prize is now being used quite frequently in this regard. They give you accolades across, and you get interviews at BBC, at CNN, and all those media outlets. And once you do that, you then begin to get good press. And once that happens, the population is also in many ways shepherded into one direction. And Zelensky was a beneficiary of that kind of propagandization. And ultimately, of course, started changing his rhetoric. And the rhetoric is, we are moving away from the Russian bear. We are going to Europe, and we are going to be part of Europe. We are going to look to the Brussels administration. We are going to look to NATO for our defense. And all these in breach of an understanding that the former countries which belong to the Soviet Union in that sphere would not be sucked into the NATO arrangement. So understood in that context, Zelensky had to be depicted as white as wool in order to ensure that his opponents were as red as crimson in terms of corruption. And that, in my view, is what was made known to the world. That is what the world believed, and I'm using the word world very loosely. And ultimately, we are now discovering that what was sold is not what was bought. And that is why we see the resignations now, and the accusations are corruption of the mega kind. You know, somebody once told me not too long ago that lies take the lift, the truth takes the stairs. And that is exactly what has happened. They had this loud voice that we had brought to Ukraine this white as wool individual. They are fighting a country that is expansionist. Russia wants to extend and is going to use its military might to decimate the entire Europe, and that the Russian administration is corrupt. We saw their hand in an American election. We see their hand in Belarus. We see their hands in the neighborhood. But now, confronted as they are with smoking gun, they are tongue-tied. It's only the German chancellor who has said something, saying we should not have corruption in Ukraine. Macron, silent for the moment. Kashtama, silent for the moment. Ursula von der Leyen, silent for the moment. But I'm quite certain that they will issue some pro forma statement, if only to tell the world we are concerned. But they are now beginning to realize, if they did not know already, that indeed they were running and supporting a scheme that was from day one characterized by corruption and underhand deals, and that the war actually facilitates it. You remember, you are buying weaponry. Remember, you are buying provisions. You remember that war in itself is an industry, and they only look the other way when the accusations or when the fingers are pointing in the direction that they want them to point. But now the chicken, in a manner of speaking, have come home to roost. You know, whenever I hear that the West is speaking about values, I always wonder which values. These people who ran slavery, these people who ran colonization, these people who are running a neocolonial project, these people who provide succor to thieves, the stolen money in Africa, in Latin America, in Eastern Europe is kept in the West. So when they talk about values, we must look at them and say, who are you to pontificate? Who are you to tell the world what the world should do? Who are you who are so culturally arrogant to tell the world what the world should do and must not do? So they can talk about their values all they want, but we know that mega corruption is alive and well. And when we remove that veneer of hypocrisy, we'll then be able to confront the West in the manner that we should. And once we are liberated of those illusions, then we will be able to confront the situation. They are now finding it very difficult to support their project, because there is a sense in which the war in Ukraine is a proxy war. And that is why every attempt at midwifing a peace process is being torpedoed by the European powers. You never know, and you can never say never. You know, the European powers are very interesting. If you look at history, they can lift you. And if your sell-by date in their view has passed, they begin to undermine you. They begin to reveal information that they knew existed all along. So it's a question of timing. Remember that the legitimacy of the Zelensky administration has been called into question because an election was not held during the due date. Perhaps they are now beginning to hold the view that Zelensky has run his course and it is the time for Zelensky to leave. And you can see the timing is very significant, that the Americans appear to be moving very close towards resolution of this conflict in some way. And Zelensky, on his part, appears to be responding to the entreaties of the Trump administration. But the appetite for the continuation of the war in Europe is high. For that reason, perhaps they are looking for somebody who will not do tango with the Trump administration and therefore, by extension, the Putin administration in Moscow. You never know. But remember, in saying this, I'm swimming in the sea of speculation. I'm sure that even within Ukraine, they are wondering who is pulling the strings. There are so many people, in my view, pulling strings. That is why you see Zelensky yo-yoing from one country to the other. At one time, he's with Macron. At one time, he's with the German Chancellor. At one time, he is with the British Prime Minister. At one time, he is with Ursula von der Leyen in Brussels. At one time, he is with the Danes. At one time, with the Norwegians. At one time, he's also with the Americans. So there is a sense in which when you talk about who is pulling the strings, it is legitimately in the plural because there are many strings and there are many people pulling the strings. And I want to imagine that sometimes even Zelensky does not know who is pulling the strings and in what direction. Two things. I think that there is war fatigue in Ukraine. I think that the legitimacy of the Zelensky administration is also at its lowest. And with these internal pressures and internal contradictions, he is beginning to realize that you cannot fight in too many fronts. You cannot be fighting in the domestic arena where your closest associates are leaving office and exposing you, and also fighting externally, fighting Russia and fighting many interests. And I think that that is why he has great appetite now to broker some kind of deal. It may not be a deal that resolves the problem at once, but you can start with détente. You can have an armistice, you can have a rapprochement, and have a period within which you stabilize so that you deal with the things that will lead to the stoppage of war and deal with the long-term issues. And once you do that, you will then be able or be in a position to go back into the domestic arena and reorganize your administration, reorganize it to deal with the question of reconstruction, to deal with the question of punishment of the perpetrators of corruption, at least punish a few of them, and then think of an election which will give the administration legitimacy. And I think those are the kind of things that the Trump administration will be confronting his delegation, which is headed or is already in Washington, that this is the reality. And this reality tells us only one story. Your own administration is in trouble. There may be internal rebellion. So deal with this situation in a manner of speaking, paddle the water while it is knee deep. Because if you don't, it will be neck deep and you will not be able to paddle it. I think that when you are negotiating from a standpoint of weakness, sometimes you may make concessions that you would not have made if there were no difficulties. So I think the deal is going to be easier to deal with. I'm not saying that it's a done deal, but you are dealing with a person who is wounded. You are dealing with a person who is now threatened both at home and abroad, and that person may very well do things that a few months ago he would not have done. That is the reality, and that reality is one that must be confronted. It's a reality that is going to inform decisions. It is a reality that is forcing the forces around Zelensky to engage in what is called realpolitik. And realpolitik sometimes requires that you do things that are not palatable to all, but necessary. You can never say never, but remember that the Western countries have always said that there are frozen funds from Russia in the neighborhood, the figures vary, of about even 300 billion, and that will be used for purposes of reconstruction of Ukraine. But there are countries that are now beginning to say, why are we spending so much money in a country where the money we spend is being embezzled? So that in the streets of London, people and the parliaments of London, that question will be asked. In Germany, it will be asked. In Denmark, it will be asked. In Paris, it will be asked. In Brussels, they'll ask those questions. And there are people who are already saying, oh, so we are giving them money and they are stealing that money. Why should we continue to do so? So we are going to begin to hear many voices which are saying we cannot continue this war because it is becoming a conduit for embezzlement of taxpayers' money from countries that are investing in it. And I think that that is a reality that we are going to see sooner rather than later. You know, sometimes when I look at Europe, I see a power struggle. a struggle that you see between particularly Britain and France. These are countries whose dominance has been waning over the years. The French have been losing their territories in Africa, and that has implications. The British are weakened both domestically and otherwise. The Germans have always been restrained after the World War, but are beginning to reassert themselves. So Macron is trying to project himself as the European leader. And you can see that. He's saying, I'm the one who has been around for the longest. You, Kanstama, came the other day. You, German Chancellor, came the other day. But I'm the person who has been the oldest boy in the block. So therefore, as the Americans would say, I'm the big kahuna. And I want my word to be the word. And you can see that he is trying to do that very frequently. And even in Italy, people like Prime Minister Meloni sometimes are restrained by the very gung-ho approach that we see Macron using in terms of what sometimes may be characterized as gunboat diplomacy. So it is a contestation of the European powers with Macron trying to project himself as the big European leader. Do the Ukrainians have faith in any European leader now? You can see that they are veering much more to the United States of America because they know that there is also a lot of doublespeak on the part of the French. And the French themselves do also have domestic contradictions. So they may appear to be strong by dint of the rhetoric of their leader, but internally they are becoming weaker and weaker. And if there is anybody who advises the Zelensky administration properly, he must now know that the Europeans are actually the lapdogs of the United States of America. And when Washington coughs, they go into a coma. And it is better to listen to Washington rather than Paris, London, or Bonn, or Brussels. If there was a word to be coined, it would be said transactional diplomacy. That is the Trump approach. And that diplomacy is the one that has characterized all these negotiations. Even earlier with Ukraine, he said, I want your resources. I broke a peace. When one looks at the relationship between Western Europe and Russia, one must go into history, and that history is well known. If you look at the history of Europe over the years, culminating in the partitioning of African countries in Berlin in 1884 and 1885, they were a colonizing machine, saying we are going into the world, first of all, to civilize the world. And once we've civilized the world, we will also take their resources. So it was always a battle of resources. Russia was not a colonizer that participated in the scramble for Africa. And if you look at that history, when the struggle for independence of many countries grew in earnest, Russia, then of course under the Soviet Union, was always inclined to the oppressed. And that, I think, is what brought about the bad blood, this idea of contestation, that Russia is seen as a counterweight, being allied to the people that were dominated by Western Europe, whether that Western Europe is represented by the British, the Germans, the Italians, the French, the Belgians, the Danes, the Norwegians, and all these happened at different settings. If you go to the World War I, we see how it happened, how the Russians at that time participated. In the World War II, we saw the iconic meetings that were held with the Russian leader and the American leader and the British leader at that time. And we saw the whole idea of the post-World War scenario where, in the words of Winston Churchill, an iron curtain had been drawn. So it became an ideological war. An ideological war that you had a Russia or a Soviet Union at that time that was articulating a different system of governance, a different economic system, seen to be competing with the West. And when the countries acquired independence, whether they were in Africa or in Latin America or in Southeast Asia, there was always this ideological competition. So Russia is seen as this competitor with an alternative economic agenda, with an alternative political agenda, with an alternative cultural agenda. And you cannot ignore her because her size is such that it is several times the size of Europe. The largest Russia now, as we know it, is the largest by land mass on earth with resources. It is a nuclear power. Therefore, you cannot bully her. So what do? You try to weaken her. You try to ensure that her neighborhood is unsafe. That is how you celebrate when the Russian Federation and the satellite states are taken apart with the collapse of the Soviet Union. That is why you lionize Mikhail Gorbachev when he comes with glasnost and perestroika, because you are seeing those as arrows that are pointed into the heart of Russia, and you think that Russia is going to collapse after glasnost and perestroika, and somehow it continues to emerge and to redefine itself. So it is, in my view, those wars that make Russia an arch enemy of the West. And even when you find an American president who wants to be inclined to Russia, you do everything in your power to ensure that the relationship is poisoned. And that is why, for example, when President Putin and President Trump appeared to be enjoying some camaraderie, they were not very happy with that, and they were very happy when that relationship appeared to be headed south. Remember that Europe as we know it still suffers from what I call colonial hangover. That hangover of being the hegemon of the world is threatened at several levels. Initially, of course, it was taken over by the United States of America, but now threatened by Russia, legitimately, threatened by China, legitimately. And you cannot expect that they will sit pretty. They'll do everything in their power to have an indirect confrontation with Russia, because they cannot afford the luxury of having direct confrontation, because this is a nuclear power which in 1 week can decimate all the major cities in Europe. You don't want to do that. The relationship between Trump and any country is one that you actually watch on a daily basis because you cannot say that this is how it's going to pan out. And of course, one of the things that he said is that Europe must now pay for her defense. And you can see the reaction in Europe is that of enhancing their defense spending. Even countries such as Germany, which were very reticent, are now moving in the direction of enhancing their expenditure. They are beginning to realize that the protection of the United States of America, which they took for granted, is no longer available for the asking. And as Trump himself said, between Russia and the United States, there is a big, beautiful ocean. So that if there is any war, that war will be fought in Europe and Eurasia. And the Americans will be far removed. So the Europeans, in my view, are in a panic mode. They don't know what to do. They appear to know what to do, but they don't know what to do. Because Trump's foreign policy is ambivalent. One time he's with them, but one time he appears to be tangoing with the Russians, appearing to be tangoing with the Turkey, tangoing with the Chinese, tangoing with Brazil. So you never quite can take the pulse of the diplomatic orientation of the United States of America. And we know that Trump is very transactional. He wants a deal made, and that deal It doesn't matter whether you are making the deal with the devil or with the angels, but let the deal be made. And Europe, for the first time in a long time, are in a state of permanent uncertainty. It is not a good place to be in. You do not know whether it is summer or winter or autumn or spring. The season can change minute by minute. You know, I was listening to Pope Leo during his visit to Turkey, and he was talking about peace. And I think one of the commentators said that, in fact, the world war is already being fought piecemeal. You see wars in Ukraine, you see it in Gaza, you see the conflict between Pakistan and Afghanistan, you see the war between Thailand and Cambodia, and you see little wars or little conflicts and skirmishes in different parts of the world. One sees a world that is very volatile. You see the gunboat diplomacy that is taking place between the United States of America and Venezuela, and it must worry one. So that peace is going to be a very unhappy commodity, in my view, in the next 10 years. Those who are in the business of peacemaking will be running around like headless chicken trying to mediate peace, because war is also a multi-billion-dollar industry, and people are trying to ensure that there is this or that conflict, thinking that they can control and contain. But one day, a single mistake is going to take place, and somebody, wittingly or unwittingly, unleashes a nuclear device. Then the world will never be the same again. And that is why I think that an institution such as the United Nations could be doing more in terms of trying to ensure that the flashpoints we see in the world are addressed very quickly, and not just the symptoms. My fear is that in addressing many of the conflicts that are taking place in the world, we are dealing with the symptoms. And as long as you deal with the symptoms, the underlying causes are ignored, and the skirmishes or the conflicts will arise again and again. Difficult times. You know, Zelensky has taken the country to war. And I'm sure within his ranks there are people who think that he has been responsible for the plight of Ukraine. There are people who, in my view, legitimately think that this war could have been avoided. There are people who legitimately think that he was forced into this war. I personally would not be surprised if there are people within Ukraine who would even say that he be prosecuted. I wouldn't be surprised. His best bet, if the war ends and he does not seek a new mandate, is possibly to find refuge somewhere in Western Europe and watch the events from afar. You know, this is a cliche that the only thing that we learn from history is that we learn nothing from history. The history is very recent that a country such as Russia, or indeed any civilization, is not very easy to eliminate. And one has seen a Europe that is preparing for war, recruiting young people into their army, increasing defense expenditure, characterizing Russia as this expansionist country that has the agenda of destroying the entire continent of Europe and her civilization. But the preferred position would be that there should be some understanding with Russia and to integrate Russia within the entire space that is Europe. Of course, Russia is both in Europe and in Asia, so we talk about Eurasia. But look at the Russian economy and how that economy has been supporting Western Europe by the provision of oil and gas. There are countries which are powered by Russian gas, and it is not going to happen that they are going to change that as quickly as they would want. So you have this neighbor. You don't have to like your neighbor, but at least accommodate the neighbor. Understand and isolate the thing that you can do together. The sooner there is appetite for good neighborliness in Europe, that will be the thing that will save that continent from a conflagration. It can be done. During the entire period of the Cold War and détente, it is not as if the Americans and the Europeans liked Russia, but they understood that there was need for accommodation, there was need for collaboration in certain areas, and there are many areas that collaboration is necessary. In the area of the use of nuclear for peaceful purposes, in the area of space exploration, in the area of climate change, in the area of artificial intelligence, so that if there was positivity on the side of Europe with reciprocity on the side of Russia, then it will be discovered sooner rather than later that the areas for collaboration rather than competition far outweigh the demand and desire and appetite for an unnecessary war that will only return Europe to the Dark Ages. But who is listening in Europe? Who is ready to be persuaded in Europe? The voices of reason are being drowned by those who are beating the drums of war. I hope that there will be some understanding, some appreciation that peace must be allowed to break out. When I see the way the UN is being undermined, so it is becoming a toothless bulldog if it is not already one, then I'm afraid that it appears that Western Europe always looks for war after some time. If it is not 40 years, then 80 years, and they think they need another one. And they are doing everything to have that war. But I hope sense will prevail.